Hey there, and welcome to the Soil and Roots podcast, digging beneath the surface to uncover the hidden ideas and desires that form us, the church, and the culture. I'm Brian Fisher, and I'm joined by handsome Kyle. As you have known, if you've been listening to the podcast for the last, 6 months, Kyle has been in the middle of moving his family, bouncing around Texas, and has finally landed in his final destination. At least we hope it's your final destination.
Yeah, hopefully so.
But he's literally in the middle of unpacking boxes. So thanks for taking time out today to be with us.
You can get a little taste of it right back there.
Yeah, if you're on video, you can see the unpacking process. Moving for me is one of the most horrible experiences that I've ever been through. I don't like it ever. I'm not one of these guys that even likes helping people move. I'm not servant-minded that way. If you need help putting a budget together or talking through a theological issue, I'm your guy. But manually moving things around, not my cup of tea.
Yeah, it's not my favorite either. And yet this is the third time that we've done this. So yeah,
wow.
You would think I would have learned my lesson, but no.
I have something to explore there, but maybe that's more for your shrink's couch than it is for the show.
Yeah, that's a different podcast. Yeah.
So this is episode 111. We're in the middle of a little bonus episode series. We're in season 5, which is called Conversations. We've had some really amazing guests on to explore some of the things that we've looked at in seasons 1 through 3. Mm-hmm. But I like to sometimes zoom out and give us a chance to breathe a little bit and remind ourselves of the context in which we find ourselves. And Soil and Roots, of course, as a mission, is intended to help solve the great omission, to help restore New Testament discipleship to the world. And in order to do that, we've laid out 4 seasons of reasons and explanations and explorations and things that we wrestle with. And so season 5 is sort of the whole thing as a chance for us to catch our breath and spend some time ruminating in some of those topics. But episode 110 was designed just to answer one question, which is just shocking to me that we haven't answered, which is what do we mean by a deep person? So if you listened to 110 or you watched 110, I spent just the first few moments reminding us of the great omission and then the 3 primary problems and what those are. But then we, wrestled with what do we mean. I think there's a lot of different ways to define it. But Kyle, I chose to define it as a deep person as somebody who is increasingly attuned or awake to 4 relationships: with God, with other people, with ourselves, and the odd one with creation and culture. So Dr. Tim is still somewhere in the United States.
Gallivanting around the country.
We've lost him. He has gone off the grid for the last month. We expect him to be back next time. So the part of Dr. Tim is going to be played by handsome Kyle. So Kyle, we'll turn over to you.
Yeah, I was just about to say that, Tim is, and we were talking about this off air, but Tim is very, very good at facilitating these kind of things and driving this machine. So I'm going to do my best to not crash us into a chiasmus.
Such lofty goals you have.
Yeah. But yeah, so as I was listening to the episode, the thing that I really appreciated about it was that we're not afraid to dive into an area that might be uncomfortable. And again, it's not easy to define a deep person. I mean, that I don't think there's one way to attain that sort of deep relationship or that sort of mentality. But I do think that there is a pathway to get there that we can all kind of ascribe to getting to. So as I was listening to the episode, I had 2 big questions. So the first one, and they're not softballs. There's some pretty, there's a lot of meat on these bones. So the first one is, if I can remember it, as I'm staring at all of the boxes. Do you think that it's possible for someone to attain this sort of level of depth that you discussed in the episode without being deeply wounded?
Well, that is not a softball question.
No.
Well, let me go back to sort of the first question you insinuated, which is how do we know
Mm-hmm.
we're in the presence of somebody who is exploring and living in the reality, the deeper things? I'm typically most aware that I'm around somebody who is thinking and existing in the deeper things of life by the questions they ask and the presence they have. So, you know, I got a phone call a couple months ago from a friend I hadn't heard from in a while. And it was hey, how's the wife? How's the kids?
Mm-hmm.
And it's a very intentional call. But as soon as he was out of the small talk, the call was over. There was nowhere else to go. That's
Yeah.
most of our interactions, right? I mean, I think in many cases, and we might even talk about theological topics or deeper relationship things, but there have been a few times in my life where somebody is so present with me, they're paying very close attention not only to my words, but they're paying attention to my body language, to my tone of voice. And I realized at that moment, oh, this person is really dialed in. They are deeply attuned versus our normal interactions, which is, we're just trying to exchange information. So
Mm-hmm.
I think that's the way God deals with us at an infinite level. I think he is perpetually aware of us and what is going on in our hearts and minds all the time. We obviously don't have that capability.
Mm-hmm.
But to the extent that we can cultivate that sort of depth, not only in understanding the heart of God and other people, but primarily with ourselves, I think that's a good definition. So, to your question, can that be catalyzed by other things beyond suffering? I think so, only because there are sort of strange exceptions to a lack of suffering in church history. So there have been some highly influential, deeply spiritual people who were very young, late teenage. I mean, even if modern times, you'd look at somebody like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who seemed to just have a depth of understanding about the human heart and God in his late teens, early 20s. And by all accounts, there's no record of him experiencing some sort of catalytic suffering that put him into that. He just was sort of, I don't know, born or inclined to experience the depth of life.
Mm-hmm.
And I think in church history, there are some shockingly younger people who wrote and experienced God and other people in a way that most of us don't. However, I don't think that's normal. I think perhaps God has just created some people here and there who seem to be born into a deep reality where the rest of us typically stumble into it, normally as a result of some sort of crisis that shakes us up and causes us, invites us to go into a deeper attunement to God, self, others, and creation. Whether we choose to do that is up to us. But so the answer is yes, but I don't think it's normative. I think most of us get there through suffering and challenge.
Yeah, I just kept thinking about when you were talking about that, about Jesus, and he chose to suffer on the cross. And I think that there may be something there as far as he knows that we are going to suffer in some way, shape, or fashion. And he wants to be able to empathize with us and to know intimately what that feels like. And for us to know that he knows that, that we know that he is very intimately aware of suffering. He is not this, cosmic being who sits in the clouds and just, gives out these directives and with no sort of knowledge whatsoever. I mean, he chose to embody our broken form, even though he was perfect. He chose this human vessel in order to really show us how much he cares for us and how much he loves us, and that he has a deep intimacy with how we feel as human beings. When I think about all of this, like, when we're trying to define depth and what that looks like and how is a deep person deep and all of this, it all goes back to him, and he set the model for us. I mean, he put himself literally in our shoes.
Well, I mean, there's a richness and an abundance that he offers that I'm not sure most people recognize as even available. I mean, in my life, in terms of my interactions with people of depth, it's primarily been people who are paid to do it. So I've gone into counseling once or twice in my life. If they're trained well, they're typically extremely attuned to God and the folks that they're serving, right? But you're there for that purpose. I've never been in AA, but AA, I'm told, is like that same thing. Like you're there for the specific reason to attune to people for the purpose of healing and redemption. And then spiritual direction is the other one, right? A spiritual director, by very nature, is supposed to come alongside as a friend and help somebody hear from God. I mean, that's the point of spiritual direction. So obviously, they're trained to attune to the Holy Spirit and to other people. But that's part of my concern, right? If most of us only experience somebody who is deeply attuned to us, typically we're going to counseling or AA or spiritual direction if we're in crisis. It's usually the case. But shouldn't that sort of be normative? Isn't that sort of the point? And the overwhelming majority of my interactions with people, and I suspect this is true for most people, occur at a very surface, heartfelt. I mean, I'm not saying it's not sincere, but if we don't first learn to attune to our own hearts, if we don't know ourselves that well, it's not possible to attune to somebody else's heart. And it's very difficult to attune to God's heart. I was writing an article on Substack this week, and there was who was it? Thomas? I think it was Thomas à Kempis. Anyway, the author had 3 quotes from church fathers. He had a Kempis, I think it was Augustine, and John Calvin, and they all basically said the same thing. Our capacity to grow to become more like Jesus, to be more attuned to God, ourselves, others, and creation, is entirely dependent on our willingness to do the same for ourselves. It's so counter modern Christianity, but there is an interdependence there. So I don't know if I've had many friendships like this where you can know somebody for years and hang out and spend time together as families and go to the coffee shops and never have any conversation that delves into anything of depth. And you realize after a while that's because the person doesn't know themselves. It's such a strange way, Kyle, to define discipleship. A person of depth, a deep disciple, is somebody who has increasing attunement. But it is impossible for me to read the Gospels and not see Jesus walk in that reality and not to be encouraging others to do the same. I think there's a profound experiential truth to this definition of deep discipleship that I frankly think is better than going through a 6 or 10 week course and coming out with some memorized Bible verses.
Yeah. Well, and didn't you say, I mean, I don't know if it was you or you quoted somebody that says you can't give away what you don't have.
Yeah.
And so if you don't understand yourself, if you don't love yourself, and if you don't have a depth of knowledge of yourself, how could you possibly understand someone else or even come to that space? I mean, it seems so, it's very simple, but at the same time, and even saying those words, like loving yourself, knowing yourself, there's a part of me like that old, everything that I was brought up with, like, nope, that's prideful, that's arrogant, that's, and I've only been recently exposed to the phrase navel gazing. But it seems like that's what it is, right? I mean, those are the little prickles that come up when I hear that. But everything, ever since I started really closely walking with Jesus about 3-4 years ago, I mean, I have to understand who I am and how I'm going through things and how I interpret things and all of this stuff. And that it does not, and I think I've said this before, it does not make me fall in love with myself. It's not anything prideful, like, oh, I'm so great. It's like, oh my word. It makes me understand how much I need him and how desperately I need to cling to him. And when I do, then I'm able to start to see things that I wouldn't have been aware of before and I wouldn't have been attuned to before. And it's this weird thing that I think the enemy's involved in it. I think that culture has been involved in it. I think that our own misguided understanding of things are involved in this idea that we can't, and it goes along with what you said about creation too. I mean, if we focus on creation or if we focus on ourselves, then we're somehow taking our mindset and taking our focus off of God and off of Jesus into creation or into ourselves, and that's wrong. But the reality is that's his creation. We are his creation. And so when we're focused on that within the umbrella of doing it because I want to know him better and I want to know myself better in order to grow closer to him, it's going to produce fruit. It's going to produce this intimacy with him. And it's not simple. It's not easy, but it does happen. I mean, I'm living proof of it. I think all of us, you, Tim, and I, with everything that we've been going through and all the stuff that we've had to deal with, as we grow, as we understand more about ourselves, we understand more about Jesus, and we become deeper disciples because of it, and not because of anything we're doing. It's because we're allowing Jesus to flow through us, and we understand our connection with him better. And so then, of course, we're going to be able to express that, I think, in a more articulate, a more meaningful, a more genuine way to other people.
Well, I think you're hitting on a major theme, which is authenticity. There is an irony that we have no problem extolling loving God or loving others, and yet when it comes to loving ourselves, all of a sudden we get really skittish. Yeah, but that's because we've been trained over and over and over and over and over and over and over again, dying to self, self-giving love, which are it's not the death of self. This is where it gets misinterpreted. But we hear these messages over so many times that we begin to assume that to love oneself is automatically selfish. Well, to love others isn't selfish, so why to love ourselves? What is that in the biblical definition of love? Why would it be any different? I think I found the quote. I was looking at it. I was listening to you, but at the same time, I was pulling this up on the internet.
It's okay.
Multitasking. Because I think it's an important quote. So David Benner wrote this, and I wrote about it on Substack. So if you're on Substack, if you go to the article called "A Dog's Life," which came out in October, you can read it. So David Benner writes, quote, "To suggest that knowing God plays an important role in Christian spirituality will not surprise anyone. To suggest that knowing self plays an equally important role will set off warning bells for many people. Yet an understanding of the interdependence of knowing self and God has held a lasting and respected place in Christian theology. Thomas à Kempis argued that a humble self-knowledge is a surer way to God than a search after deep learning. And Augustine's prayer was, 'Grant, Lord, that I may know myself, that I may know thee.' These are but a small sample of the vast number of theologians who held this position. Christian spirituality involves a transformation of the self that occurs only when God and self are both deeply known. There is no deep knowing of God without a deep knowing of self, and no deep knowing of self without a deep knowing of God." John Calvin wrote, "Nearly the whole of sacred doctrine consists in these two parts, knowledge of God and of ourselves."
I have never heard that. Growing up in church, I never heard that uttered anywhere. Did you?
Well, no. That's why I think the discipleship dilemma is one of the key obstacles to spiritual formation. It wasn't, in my case, I don't ever recall it being rejected.
No.
But I don't recall a single, maybe I wasn't paying attention. I mean, I've sat through literally thousands of church services. I don't recall a single sermon, passage, message, service oriented around the importance of dealing and knowing our authentic selves as a means of growing in the graces of God, ever. It was all very, very God-focused and or Jesus-focused, which is tremendous. The problem is that then we run into passages like in Ephesians 4, God is over all, through all, and in all, that now we're confused, saying, well, wait a second. We split these things apart as if knowledge of self is somehow wrong, bad. Certainly we're not trained to do it. And now we have these feelings of guilt and shame when we get into our midlife crisis or whatever and realize, oh my gosh, we don't know ourselves. By the way, that means that we don't know God all that well. Isn't that striking? I mean, the à Kempis quote, "A humble self-knowledge is a surer way to God than a search after deep learning." I mean, in modern language, he's saying knowledge of self is more important than a formal education. More formative.
I would love to say that to a group of people and just see what they would do.
So your comment about authenticity, though, is very important. I wonder how many of us want to know ourselves authentically because we understand that there's some wonderful things about us and there's some tough stuff about us that gets into our identity, our true sense of love for ourselves and others and God. And if we're making decent money and we're taking our annual vacations and we're putting food on the table, well, why bother? Mm-hmm. That's why, to me, suffering is usually a major catalyst into this inward journey.
So, my next question, which is not easier, but as I was listening to the episode and I was really thinking about this, I thought, well, okay, we'll talk to Brian about this. So, do you think that if we had to split everybody up into two camps, like believers and non-believers, if we just split everybody into those two groups, do you think that the Christian group would be comprised of more deep people, or would the non-Christian group have more deep people in it? What do you think? Now, in 2024, I'm not talking about, and we can think about, like past history and everything, but I was just thinking right now, would there be more deep people in the Christian group, or would there be more deep people in the non-Christian group?
I'm not sure it's an answerable question.
I know, but it's just something to wrestle with.
Well, directly. So, because a Christian would arguably dive into self for the purpose of deepening their relationship with God, self, and others.
But whereas we don't somebody all do that.
No, I understand that. But whereas somebody who doesn't hold to the Judeo-Christian God, mm-hmm. the journey into self would be for different reasons. Meaning, mm-hmm. I think you can not be a Christian and be very attuned to other people's emotions and hearts and be very empathetic and be very self-giving for sure. No question. But obviously not for the purpose of experiencing a deeper intimacy with God.
Right. Yeah. And so I guess I need to clarify the question. And because when I was thinking about it, it wasn't, because you're right, that is confusing. So not... When I say a deep person in this context, I'm talking about somebody who is, like you said, attuned to another person, not just wanting to get something out of them or completely oblivious to their story or, just kind of listening to them for waiting for their turn to talk. Somebody who is a deep person, not necessarily a deep disciple or deeply chasing after Jesus, a person of depth that without, if we take the God hunt out of it. Does that make sense?
Oh, so you mean somebody who's just attuned to the hearts of other people really well?
Right. Yeah. Do you think there's more people in the Christian group or non-Christian?
I would have the question. My answer is, unfortunately, at this point in history, I'm not sure there would be a difference. I don't know the answer to it. And my experience is so limited in both those groups. How many people does one person get to know? Right. If you're asking in my interactions with people who are not yet following Jesus, do I find them to be more attuned than people who do? It's probably 50-50 split for me. But I would say what's shocking to me is the vast majority of my interactions have been with people who do claim to follow Jesus. And at least in my story, I've encountered very, 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 very few people of depth. Mm-hmm. Some wonderful, kind, gentle, amazing people, don't get me wrong. Mm-hmm. But I haven't gotten the sense from many people at all that they are deeply interested and attuned in other people's hearts. We're typically very focused on our own stuff, our own messes, our own situations. And we live such frantic lives. We're just trying to make our money and retire and, live whatever the good life is. We're not really paying that close attention. And so as long as we get to church, we get our Bible study, we check our box, and nothing crazy happens, we sort of live on that surface level. Again, my challenge is that you cannot read the Gospels and see any of that in Jesus. Every time he's interacting with somebody, he's probing their hearts. And he's inviting them into a deeper relationship.
Right. Yeah. And then to kind of circle back to the original question, do you think that pain and suffering is the catalyst for that? Because if we're just, kind of ticking our boxes and doing the thing and living our frantic lives, when pain, suffering, catastrophe is introduced into that, then it's an opportunity to dive into those depths with him.
Yeah, most of the time. And I think, again, going back to the Gospels, Jesus's one-on-one interactions with people are, with his disciples, obviously. I mean, he spent 3 years living with them.
Mm-hmm.
But in terms of the strangers he met or the other folks that interacted with him, most of the time they're in crisis.
Mm-hmm.
So people that desperately need physical healing. The woman caught in adultery is about to be stoned. He rescues her life. The woman at the well has spent untold number of years in social rejection as an outcast. Like, the people whom he invites into a deeper experience with him, a deeper attunement with him, are people who are very acquainted with rejection, abandonment, betrayal, suffering. And even when he gets on the Pharisees' case and shames them in public, there's a sense there that he's just using a different mechanism to invite them to shake up and to awaken to their legalistic state. And he's inviting them to shed that and experience the freedom of genuine Christianity. It's just, he uses a very different, not as compassionate approach when he's calling them brood of vipers. Yeah. So I think that's the case. Yeah.
And that's another thing. That's a great point, because he does it in such different ways for different people. Like,
customized every time.
What's that?
It's customized every time.
Yeah, every time. And growing up, I always, I thought of the Pharisees as they were the enemy. They were the bad guy. They were the villain. But the more I start reading and the more I really start getting into it, I'm like, he really was, like you said, he was inviting them to look at it from a different perspective, to really look inward and to look at themselves, at what they're doing. He wasn't rejecting them. He wasn't saying, oh, well, I'm done with you. It's more of a, hey, I want you to really take a look at what you're doing and what I'm saying, and then come back to me and talk to me about that. I mean, it just seems so much more loving. At the same time, he's not this, Jesus is not this passive, just sort of, he's extremely strong. He's extremely forthright. But at the same time, there's always that grace. There's always that opportunity if the other person wants to take it. And
yeah, Nicodemus is an example who he sort of shrinks away from his family at night and comes and sees Jesus, but Jesus invites him in, has the conversation. At the same time, Jesus was brutal with them in public.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah.
He did not mince. We sometimes assume Jesus is this nice guy pacifist. It's very hard to read the Gospels and get that sense that he's a pacifist in the sense of a people-pleasing person, or that he's gentle and nice 100% of the time. He's not. However, I think if you read Acts, there's evidence that there's quite a few Pharisees and former legalists who join the way. They, post-resurrection, do come around and follow Jesus into that depth. So all of his customized, particularized, right? It's one of our favorite words, ways of relating to people, have been effective. But in every single case, he's inviting them into a deeper awakening to who he is and who they are. And some people accept that and some people reject that. The rich young ruler rejects it.
Yep.
Peter, on several occasions, sometimes accepts it, sometimes rejects it. So the reason that the discipleship dilemma is listed in my mind as the first primary problem, the formation gap and the forgotten kingdom are huge issues, and they need to be addressed in modern Christianity. But if we don't embrace what 1,500 years of Christianity understood as a matter of course, which is self-knowledge is absolutely essential to the journey into deeper discipleship, the rest of this is going to be a struggle. It's first because, to me, it's actually the most pressing. Our stories, our personalities, our sin patterns, dealing authentically with the way that we think about ourselves, the way that we think about people, going well beyond basic Bible study and allowing the Bible to actually mold us and move us. These are things that, by and large, are, in my opinion, missing, and we need to recapture.
It can get confusing. It can go sideways real fast. And a lot of people just don't want to deal with that. They just, for the longest time, I just refused to do any of it for myself because I was just convinced that I was too broken. I was too messed up. There was no way I couldn't even entertain the idea that God loved me or liked me. I knew he loved me, but it was more of out of an obligation. And so I just rejected that for so long. But then I started realizing that, well, there's a control element to that, because if I convince myself of that, then I can't be hurt, even though I was hurting. Well, I'm not going to open myself up to the possibility that he really does like me, because what if I'm wrong? What if I let that happen and, oh no, my worst fear is right and Jesus doesn't really like me? It's just more of a, I kind of have to because I said it in the Bible, and that's who I am. But it just, when we just let go, it's like a marriage, it's like a friendship. You were talking earlier about how you have, it's very rare that you have people that are attuned to you. It's because I think, we've been hurt so many times, and we put up these walls and these guards of, I'm not going to, I've opened myself up to a person and they took advantage of that, or they didn't reciprocate. And so forget it. I'm going to close that off. I am not going to go down that road anymore. I'm not going to be hurt. I am not going to be weakened. I'm not going to be duped, taken advantage of. And it's hard. It's scary to do that, to allow yourself to be, okay, well, I know that I could be hurt here. I know that this person could hurt me, but I'm willing to take the chance because I want to be authentic. I want to enter into a genuine relationship with this person. And it's different with Jesus because we're not going to be hurt from him. Now, we're still going to be hurt, but not by him. We're going to be hurt by other things and different circumstances and our interpretation of things in the world the way that it is. Yes, we're going to be disappointed and hurt, but he will never do that to us. And that's, for me, that's been the thing that has been so hard to embrace and accept.
Well, to love is to risk. Genuine love. Like there is no genuine love without risk.
Mm-hmm.
I think you said a lot of interesting, meaty stuff there, but I would probably go back. I'm not sure I could say that loving Jesus doesn't mean he won't hurt us.
You know what? As I was saying that, I was like, I'm sure Brian's going to say something about that.
Well, I think there's a difference between, did Jesus hurt Peter's feelings when post-resurrection he said, hey, he asked him 3 times, feed my sheep, feed my lambs. Peter was wounded by that. I think when Jesus did confront the Pharisees in public and call them names, that probably hurt.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure following Jesus means that he's never going to hurt us or our feelings. In fact, I think it's probably incumbent in it. I think there's a difference, though, between that and something that isn't for our good. Meaning,
right.
There's hurting somebody for our goodness, and there's hurting somebody to wound them and destroy them.
Right.
I don't think Jesus destroys us. That's not part of the deal. But I think sometimes the most loving thing to do is to say something or do something that might hurt.
Oh, you're right.
In a way that's good for them. We'll wrap up here, but I'm just curious what you thought about being more attuned and awake to creation and culture as an aspect of deep discipleship. You do?
I love it. Yeah, I absolutely love it, because again, I never really thought about it. It's so funny because when you talk about creation, like the first thing that I think about is like, I get the tree hugger, the hippie image in my head, and it's like, oh, somebody that's fighting for the environment and all this. I never, ever stopped to think about, well, of course we should be doing that. As believers, we should be fighting for the earth. We should be fighting for creation, because this is the creation that God made. He's the one that crafted it. Why wouldn't we defend it? Why wouldn't we want to champion it? And I think that's absolutely true, that we need to have more believers in environmental groups. We need to have more people in the parks departments and recycling and doing all that stuff. It's wonderful. And I don't know how in the world it got twisted into, this sort of new age, like you said, this sort of mystical kind of, it's Mother Nature and all this. I think, and again, I think you'll probably disagree with this, but I think the enemy's behind a lot of that, just the misdirection and causing us to think, well, no. You can't worry about the earth, because if you worry about the earth, then you're going to worship the earth. It's like ourselves, right? If we focus on ourselves and learning and knowing ourselves intimately, well, then you're going to become prideful. You're going to become arrogant. I think it's the same kind of lie with culture and with creation. If we care about that, if we're really into it, then, it's going to become your God. And no, the truth is, if we're coming at it with Jesus, it's going to make him more real.
Well, my theory that modern Christianity, for the most part, has reduced Jesus, the kingdom, God himself, to pieces and parts instead of the perspective that was probably more prominent in the Middle Ages and maybe even before, which is the whole idea that God is over all, through all, and in all, that the whole earth is his kingdom, that Christianity is more than saying a sinner's prayer, just waiting around to die until we experience eternal life. We have all these ideas that have reduced Jesus, that are deeply ingrained in our souls, and so when we hear what does it mean to rule and steward the earth, we immediately swing the pendulum too far and associate it with the worship of things in creation or self or others versus the stewardship and love of those things. Mm-hmm. And so, we ignore them or we exploit them or, name your abuse of creation and culture and other people. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I the more that I've meditated on it, Kyle, I think Richard Foster, when he said what the world desperately needs is deep people, he's exactly right.
Oh, yeah.
People, and it's not just deep thinkers. It's not meaning most knowledgeable. It means people who are so in tune with themselves authentically and so in tune with God authentically that they just love differently. They see reality differently. They hear and listen to things differently. Mm-hmm. They just live in, I think, the more abundant life, which is to me a life of greater depth than what most of us experience. And they tend to be, whether it's only in their just family or in their little community or their town, or they become, movement makers, they tend to be the most transformative because of the way they love, which is based on this depth. And that's why I think the work that Soil & Roots is doing and others along these lines are so important. I think it's the mouth of the river. I think if we figure out how to come together and become people of depth, it's a worldwide game changer.
Absolutely.
Well, thanks for being with me today, Kyle. Good job. I know you have some boxes to unpack, so we're gonna wrap up. Yeah, you're excited. How excited are you about that?
Oh, on a scale of 1 to 10, it's just 50. I can't wait.
Yeah, I could see it in your face.
Just awesome.
I can hear it in your voice.
Just so excited about that.
Well, thanks to all of you for watching or reading or listening to this Soil & Roots podcast. As always, you can get more information on Soil & Roots at our website, which is soilandroots.org. You can follow us on Facebook and Instagram, if you want, at Soil & Roots Podcast. The short form stuff sometimes drives me crazy, but we're there to serve and love you.
We are.
And then if you want some deeper, richer content, you can find us on Substack at just Soil & Roots. And we've been cultivating a great community there and doing quite a bit of writing that sort of dovetails along with what we're doing here on the podcast. And then we're also on YouTube. If you want the full catalog of audio and video episodes going back now 2.5 years, you can find us on YouTube at Soil & Roots. We are a crowd-funded organization. If God has so led you to financially support our work of cultivating deep discipleship worldwide, you can do that safely and securely at the website at Soil & Roots. We'd love to have you as a financial supporter. If you are already one, thanks so much for chipping in and helping us get the word out. If you want to reach us by email, you can do so at fish@soilandroots.org. This podcast is produced in-house at Fish Tank Studios, primarily by Zach Fisher. He also produces the music for the podcast. You can catch him on Spotify at FishU. Thanks so much for being with us, and we'll see you next time.